Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and it's Tag Tuesday, and I have been tagged in an original tag by Tristan from Elspace Books, and this is The Journey of Your Life book tag. I hope I've got the name of that right. So this is talking about books connected to the places that you have lived in your life. I should imagine there's a few different ways to interpret this. You might want to pick books that meant something to you at that time of your life. I've taken the direction of picking books that are related to the areas that I've lived, and if I've read that book, so much the better. Before the age of 3, I'd already lived in Leighton Buzzard and Romsey. I have no memories of these places, so I'm not going to say anything about them. But we then moved to Wiltshire, where I lived for 2 periods of my life. So I get to choose twice. So I lived in a small town called Westbury, which has as a claim to fame a chalk horse carved onto a hill. And I lived on that hill, or in the lee of that hill, so that horse loomed large in my childhood. The horse does make an appearance in literature. There's a book called the Tontine by Thomas Costain, a book called the Emigrants by George Lamming, and it's also the area where one of the characters in The English Patient does some military training. But the work I've chosen is one of the possible reasons there is a horse on that hill in the first place. Details are sketchy, but there's always a story that Alfred the Great had instructed the carving to be made after he beat the Danish at the Battle of Ethandune. Now, Ethandune is now Eddington, which is a village about 4 or 5 miles from Westbury, and basically on the other side of that hill. So it's plausible. The horse at that point, and here we're relying on early 18th century descriptions, was smaller and faced the opposite direction. And someone took it upon themselves in the late 1700s to get rid of that pagan, medieval, old looking horse and replace it with something a bit more representative of what a horse actually looked like, and coincidentally a little like the emblem of the Hanoverian kings who'd just taken over. Still, whichever direction the horse was facing in, and however the horse looked, the piece I've chosen is about Alfred beating the Danes at the Battle of Ethandune, and that is The Ballad of the White Horse by G.K. Chesterton. At the age of 7, I find myself moving again, this time to Harare in Zimbabwe. This is 3 years after the independence of this country, and we are there as part of the Overseas Development Agency. I'm there strictly as baggage, as my dad, who was part of the Overseas Development Agency. I suppose it's in retrospect I realise how weird a move that was at the time when you're 7 years old. Yes, it's a wrench, but you take it in your stride. So there I was, in southern Africa, running, jumping, climbing trees. Not a lot of time for books. There were books that I did reread quite a bit because there wasn't a huge choice. But I think it's when I first began reading stuff like The Famous Five, when I first read Jules Verne or Charles Dickens, although in shortened form for younger children. And I think the only book I would have read, which was even about the area, the vague area of where I was living, was King Solomon's Mines, which is probably not the best option to choose. But I do have a couple of picks possibly uppermost in my mind because I'm reading through all of the books I have of his this year, and because the book stops briefly in the second city of Zimbabwe, Bulawayo, and I believe stops in Harare as well, very briefly, when Harare was still called Salisbury, is the venture to the interior. Now, this is not related to my experience of Zimbabwe. It is a generation, 2 generations before I lived there. It's a whole different world, but the description of the natural world in this book is very evocative and is like eating a whole bag full of madeleines for me. The best book I can think of about Zimbabwe is possibly Harvest of Thorns. There are a number of other works from Zimbabwe, and at some point I should probably read some of these. But after 3 years in Harare, I find myself back in Wiltshire, and I stay in Wiltshire until the age of 18, and this is the part of my life where I find grown-up books. And if I'm looking for another book about Wiltshire, well, the top of that hill where the horse is, and over the Iron Age fort, which is on top of that hill, is Salisbury Plain. And at the other end of Salisbury Plain is Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is where Tesla d'Urberville finds herself in a moment of crisis. So I'll pick Tesla d'Urberville from Thomas Hardy. It was certainly whilst I was living in Wiltshire that I first started reading Thomas Hardy. So I'll pick that for want of anything else. Then to Norwich to study literature. And it's not a bad place to study literature. In 1608, Norwich is the first city to have a provincial public library. In 1850, Norwich is the first city to implement the Public Library Act. In 1413, Julian of Norwich is the first woman to write a story in the English language. In 2012, Norwich becomes England's first city to be a city of literature. I think it's fair to say that at the age of 18 I didn't know these things, and in fairness, one of them had not yet happened. I was there purely because there was a literature course I wanted to do. But it's not the only literature course that the university offered. It was also the home of, and still is, the most famous master's course in creative writing in the country. And the book I will therefore choose is by the first person to graduate that master's course, which was Ian McEwan. So I will choose Atonement as the book. I don't do my master's in Norwich. I go to Cardiff to do it. I don't think I've read a book set in Cardiff or that has anything to do with Cardiff. I certainly don't feel like picking Jacques Lacan, Jean Baudrillard or Jacques Derrida as my choice, because these were the books that I was reading at that year. So I will just expand it to Wales, and I will choose, I think, possibly the first book that got me into grown-ups books, and that is Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas. The world of Under Milkwood and the world of Cardiff are very different. After Cardiff, I moved again, very briefly, back to Wiltshire, and then on to Bristol. So, just a way over the Severn from Cardiff. Now here there are two good choices to make. there are plenty of associations with Bristol in Treasure Island, but I think the book I will pick is going to be Robinson Crusoe, because one of the pubs that I used to go to in Bristol was the Langdower Trowel, which is the pub in which Daniel Defoe met Selkirk, who was the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. But after Bristol, I moved to London. There's so many choices you can make about London, but I think I'll just pick on a writer who I read a few of his books whilst I was living there, and someone who I think can capture that craziness, that sort of psychosis of living in such a massive city, and that would be Will Self. So maybe I would choose The Quantity Theory of Insanity or Tough Tough Toys for Tough Tough Boys. But after London, I moved to Kent, and I don't think there is one book I can choose that represents it. There are local authors, which I've spoken about before on the channel. There are certainly plenty of books I've read since I've been here, which have spoken to me. But I think probably what is most representative is just this monolith behind me and the multitude of different directions that I find my interest going into. So the book I choose is Everything, which only leaves me with the final prompt for this, which is a book about where you hope to go next. We hope to go back to Norwich, and hopefully we will. It might be fun to see the university again. It will be fun to see the old city again. And maybe it's time to drag Julian of Norwich back into this, writing in the early 15th century, where she says, "All shall be well." You've got to try to look on the bright side, haven't you? So thank you to Tristan for tagging me, and I will tag people below the line. But until the next time, happy trails.